I'm Dr. Michael Chemers. I'm the director of the UCSC Center for Monster Studies. This conference was my idea, for better or for worse, and we're very, very happy to be inaugurating the actual scholarly part of the conference today with this panel. I'm very excited about this panel because, as you can see on the agenda, my colleague, Dr. Analola Santana from Dartmouth, was scheduled to be the moderator for this panel. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it to the conference this year, and I was secretly thrilled, not because I didn't want to see Analola, because I do. We've written 2 books together, but because werewolves are my favorite monster. And I thought, oh, I'll do it. I'll moderate the panel. I'll moderate the panel. So I am absolutely head over heels about werewolves. And so when this panel was proposed, I personally was extremely enthusiastic about it. And this was the only group that proposed a full panel. Everybody else was just proposing single papers. But this group proposed a panel together, and I was so excited about it, so happy to be a part of it. So let me introduce our speakers today. On the right here is Sam Langsdale. In response to Marvel TV special Werewolf by Night on Disney+, Sam received the following text from a friend: "Werewolf by Night, bisexual delight." I'm reading from, is this okay if I'm reading from your bio?
Yeah.
Okay, great. She emphatically agreed, but on further reflection began to wonder what made us both so confident that this was a queer text resonant with bisexual experience, which is something I'm very interested in to know also. Why are werewolves bisexual icons? Was it director Michael Giacchino's choice to shoot the majority of the film in black and white, evoking the aesthetics of classic Hollywood horror films that demarcated a space of psychosexual transgression? Was it that as 2 bisexual women, people situated outside a patriarchal heterosexist order and the popular cultural text that it produces, we more readily acceded to the cinematic monster's subjective position? Was it the nature of monsters as being simultaneously indicative of fears and desires? Yes, all this. As the paper suggests, this aspect of Marvel TV's special makes a queer reading possible. Further, in highlighting how temporality affects others' perceptions of the main character, Jack Russell, classic, Werewolf by Night, I argue that the film may be read as an exploration of bisexuality. Just as Jack is initially accepted and treated without suspicion in his human form, and later feared and hunted in his werewolf form, so too are bisexuals accepted as normal when they appear monosexual and rejected as deviant when their preferences for both the same and other genders become clear. So we're looking forward to that, Sam. Oh, I read the wrong thing. That was your abstract.
That's my abstract. It's okay. I'm going to skip the whole first paragraph, so you just save me some time.
I'm so sorry.
Okay?
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Let me tell you about Sam, however.
Well, I mean, that's me in a paragraph. Marvel, bisexuality, spooky stuff. We're good.
Yeah. But Sam is an independent feminist scholar whose work focuses on the cultural politics around representation of gender, sexuality, and race in visual culture. Her comics research, which I'm particularly interested in, has been published in peer-reviewed journals such as Signs, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, and in award-winning volumes like Supersex, Sexuality, Fantasy, and the Superhero. She's particularly proud of being the co-editor of Monstrous Women in Comics, which is amazing. Okay, great. Next is John Edward Martin. I won't read your abstract, John. John is a scholarly communication librarian at the University of North Texas and a scholar of horror literature, film, and comics. His scholarship has been published in Poe and Women, Recognition and Revision, Deciphering Poe, Subtext, Context, Subversive Meanings, and Fear and Learning, Essays on the Pedagogy of Horror. Fantastic. Welcome, John. And Spencer Keralis is an independent media historian and digital humanist whose work examines the mediation of the HIV-positive body in DIY publications. Their scholarship has appeared in the journals Book History, American Periodicals, Hyper-Riz, New Media Cultures, and in the collections Disrupting the Digital Humanities Workshops, Lessons Learned, and Debates in Digital Humanities. Big Monster Festival welcome for the werewolf panel. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yes. All right. Ooh. Oh dear. Okay. Gentle touch. Okay. So I am going to just skip the first paragraph, but really this paper is inspired because I got this wonderful text from my friend, and it just absolutely hit home in every conceivable way. And so I started thinking, like, why? What about this spoke to me so strongly? So just one point of clarification. I'm not necessarily trying to argue that any particular character is bisexual, although I think that, is a viable interpretation. And while I'm going to start by talking about how I think there could be a number of queer readings of this particular film, I'm going to try to spend most of my time just talking about the queer readings that I think are particularly evocative of bisexual desire, identity, and experience. So, Werewolf by Night begins, as all MCU media do, with characteristic title shots and theme music that give viewers glimpses of previous shows and films starring a core cast of heroes. However, after only a few seconds, the theme music is interrupted by a ferocious growl, and claw marks tear across the screen as the standard multicolor title sequence flickers to black and white. The claws slash through both image and sound again and again until finally the words Marvel Studios hang in the middle of the frame in sleek shades of chrome. The text is struck by lightning and sizzles with electricity before giving way to the opening scenes. A narrator tells the audience that beneath the world of heroes there is darkness, and through it lurks monsters and horrors. Also in the world below are hunters who ruthlessly stalk monsters to keep evil at bay. No family is more committed to this mission than the Bloodstones. As wielders of a supernatural weapon after which they are named, the family leads the secret cabal of monster hunters. The patriarch of the family, Ulysses Bloodstone, has died. Hunters from all over the world are gathering at his funeral to conduct a ritual hunt and to compete for control of the Bloodstone. Now it is clear. No matter what one assumes to be true about Marvel media, there can be no doubt that this special is unlike its predecessors. This is not a superhero film. This is a monster movie. And as disruptive as the superhero status quo as that sounds, Michael Giacchino queers the genre even further by adopting a classical Hollywood aesthetic. Spoiler for my best slide. Okay, so as just described, the opening sequence, the choice to shoot in black and white, the cinematography, the plot, and the setting of Werewolf by Night all evoke classical Hollywood monster movies of the 1930s and 40s. According to Harry Benshoff, this genre oozes queerness. First, quote, certain sectors of the population still relate homosexuality, and I would suggest queerness generally, to bestiality, incest, necrophilia, sadomasochism, etc., the very stuff of classical Hollywood monster movies. Second, following Robin Wood, Benshoff writes, quote, that the thematic core of the horror film might be reduced to three interrelated variables: normality, as defined chiefly by heterosexual patriarchal capitalism; the other, embodied in the figure of the monster, and the relationship between the two. As such, many monster movies and the source material upon which they draw might be understood as being about the eruption of some form of queer sexuality into the midst of a resolutely heterosexual milieu. This is certainly true of Werewolf by Night. Amongst the other hunters gathered at the dead patriarch's funeral is his prodigal daughter, Elsa Bloodstone. Although tradition dictates that Ulysses' power and capital should have passed to his heir, Elsa's choice to leave the family business disrupts normality. As the hunt unfolds, Elsa chooses to cooperate with the protagonist of the film, Jack Russell, such a good boy. And together they set free Man-Thing, the plant humanoid monster being hunted. Of course, what further reinforces the queerness of this scenario is the revelation that although Jack is a hunter, he is not like the rest of the cabal, because he himself is a kind of monster. Jack is a werewolf. Thus, Elsa's atypical attempt at gaining control of the Bloodstone, paired with her cooperation with not one but two monsters, brings the heteronormative patriarchal Bloodstone traditions crashing down. Third, the setting and cinematography of Werewolf by Night also harken back to the queer tradition of Hollywood monster movies. As Benshoff notes, the look of the genre, adapted from German expressionist cinema, helped further to demarcate a space of psychosexual transgression. True to the tropes of Gothic literature, the physical spaces inhabited by the classical Hollywood monsters reflect their twisted nature and dark, mysterious secrets. Giacchino's choice to shoot the special in black and white enhances its classic Hollywood look and delivers the kind of twisted mystery Benshoff describes. The stark shadows that fall over the corners of the Bloodstone Mansion and its inhabitants create tension, and the maze through which the hunters chase Man-Thing is full of twists, turns, and crevices that hide both the hunters and hunted. Like the 1941 film The Wolfman, Giacchino's Werewolf by Night uses flashes of lightning, flames, and monstrous electrical shocks to momentarily illuminate what is otherwise draped in shadow and darkness. Yay! All of these characteristics certainly align with Benshoff's reading of classic Hollywood monster movies as queer. But again, what makes my friend and I so sure that Werewolf by Night may also be read as symbolic of bisexual experience? On one level, it may be as simple as the fact that as bisexual women, we know it when we see it. Building on the work of Alexander Doty, Benshoff suggests, quote, that any film viewed by a gay or lesbian, or in this case, bisexual spectator, might be considered queer. The queer spectator's gaydar, already attuned to the possible discovery of homosexuality within culture at large, here functions in relation to specific cultural artifacts. Because Marvel's special is also about a specific character, Jack Russell, aka Werewolf by Night, my friend and I may have been particularly drawn to this text. Benshoff writes that as the titular stars of their own filmic stories, perhaps it is the monsters that the audience comes to enjoy, experience, and identify with. Duh. Further, Benshoff writes the cinematic monster's subjective position is more readily acceded to by a queer viewer, someone who already situates herself outside a patriarchal, heterosexist order and the popular cultural text that it produces. And indeed, I find Jack's subject position very relatable. When he first enters the Bloodstone family estate, he appears in his human form and is welcomed by the rest of the Cabal. Although viewers only see him as a human, either familiarity with the film's source material or retroactive understanding reinforces the fact that he is also a werewolf. Throughout the course of the special, Jack is both hunter and hunted, man and wolf, hero and victim. Because of the sequential nature of film, these aspects are revealed through time, a point I will return to. But by the end of the special, viewers are confronted with the realization that all of these things were true simultaneously. Jack is never really one or the other, but always both. Similarly, bisexual people can be attracted to or in relationships with people of the same or other genders. Even when we appear monosexual, it is never the case that our desires and intimate experiences with people of the same or other genders cease to be. As Maria Sanfilippo asserts, bisexual media studies demonstrates how bisexuality is already present, if obscured, hidden in plain sight, by modes of representation and reading confined within monosexual logic. In this way, Jack, like bisexual people, adheres to Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's discussion of monsters when he writes that these kinds of subjects break apart bifurcating either-or syllogistic logic with a kind of reasoning closer to and/or. Unfortunately, another aspect of Jack's experience that I and many others can relate to is the stigma attached to and/or subjectivity. While the Cabal treat Jack with acceptance in his human form, the revelation of his monstrosity generates fear, suspicion, and violence. According to Christian Kless, non-heterosexual relationships have been depicted as deviant, bizarre, pathological, problem-ridden, and fragile, if not impossible, across a whole range of genres of popular culture, including film. Moreover, film representations frequently highlight the threatening, insatiable, and excessive character of bisexuals. Watch out, you're sitting really close to me.
Sitting closer to me.
Hey, you're trapped in here with me. Wait. Okay, these kinds of stereotypes resonate with long-standing characteristics ascribed to werewolves. As Amy Ransom notes, the bestial nature of the werewolf links it to sexuality as an expression of our animal nature, a destructive force to be feared. In Werewolf by Night, the widow Verussa Bloodstone traps Elsa and Jack together in a cage and supernaturally triggers Jack's transformation in the hopes that his werewolf form will indeed prove so insatiable, excessive, and destructive that he will murder Elsa, the daughter responsible for disrupting patriarchal tradition, and in turn be justifiably eradicated himself. In the case of both bisexuals and werewolves, these kinds of problematic representations highlight anxieties about metamorphosis, and as Ransom writes, address our deepest fears about identity and change. Both werewolves and bisexual subjects elicit these deep fears because their appearance through time causes what Sanfilippo calls a crisis of signification. Bisexuality, she writes, unlike heterosexuality or homosexuality, seems to rely on a temporal component for its actualization. At any given moment, a bisexual person or character might appear monosexual depending on his or her present gender of object choice, thus contributing to bisexual invisibility. In other words, this kind of logic positions bisexuals as either invisible or hypervisible depending on the point at which they are being scrutinized. Similarly, while Jack remains relatively invisible as a man, he becomes hypervisible as a werewolf. This queer temporality creates problems for Jack, whose life and mission to save his companion are endangered once he is revealed. For bisexual subjects who insist on having the expansiveness of their desires recognized, there is risk of experiencing homophobia in heteronormative contexts and/or distrust and dismissal in queer contexts. However, again, as Cohen argues, within these same restrictive logics resides the potential to slither out of them. As systems of signification multiply and aim to fix monstrous subjects in singularly knowable ways, the possibilities of escape, resistance, disruption arise with more force. This subversive potential is precisely what links werewolves and queer subjects for Lisa Metherell. She writes, coming out as queer, and again, I would say more specifically as bisexual, rather than gay or lesbian, may be more akin to coming out as a werewolf in its challenges to cultural intelligibility. That is, in its potential to exceed a categorical and knowable identity. Thus, the promise of the werewolf and the queer as ungrounded subjects whose identities cannot be fully contained within normative categories of knowing and being lies in their potential to disturb epistemological dualisms. Another way that Werewolf by Night demonstrates the disruptive potential and further echoes bisexual experience is in its construction of relationships. While superhero media are by no means homogeneous, representations of romantic and erotic relationships in comics, TV shows, and films have long been overdetermined by heteronormativity. Given its hour-long runtime, the relationships we see in the special are only really hinted at, but nevertheless, I'd like to suggest that they demonstrate an expansiveness that exceeds the superhero status quo. Early on, viewers discover that Jack has entered the hunt in order to save his companion Ted, aka Man-Thing. When Jack first manages to find Ted in the maze, Ted takes Jack by surprise by reaching out his enormous clawed hand to grab Jack, but then pull him into a snuggly little embrace. It's so sweet. The two express relief and delight at having found each other and then engage in familiar squabbling with each other, arguing which one of them actually needs to be saved. Later in the conversation with Elsa, Jack refers to Ted as his family, and at the conclusion of the film, when Jack wakes up from his transformation, he finds Ted making him coffee, ready to hand him a cloak to cover his now human nakedness. It has a very morning after feel. There is no explicit mention of erotic or desire or romantic love in these interactions, but I think what can't be denied is tenderness, genuine care, and purposeful connection. In many ways, Jack and Ted resemble what Benshoff describes as the domestic queer couple of the late 1930s monster movies, repeated pairings of the mad scientist and his sidekick, for instance, or of monstrous actors like Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, contributed to homosocial, if not homoerotic, stories that obscured and overshadowed the taken-for-granted desirability of heterosexual romance. Equally important to Jack's story, however, is Elsa Bloodstone. Here again, I'm not necessarily suggesting that their connection is explicitly romantic or erotic, but their interactions nonetheless subvert toxic dualistic norms. After they've been trapped in the cage, Jack frantically begins trying to imprint on Elsa. He deeply sniffs her wrists. He cups the back of her head and sniffs her hair. These are both parts of the body that are generally reserved for intimate contact. Once he is transformed into a werewolf, it is Elsa's fearless determination to call him back to himself that saves them both as she gently caresses his face, which is not visible with all the sunlight, but that's essentially what's happening there. As with his relationship to Ted, Jack's relationship to Elsa can only explicitly be read as tender and caring. However, what Jack doesn't do to Elsa is perhaps more powerful in terms of a queer interpretation. If, as mentioned before, the male werewolf's bestial nature signifies a kind of insatiable, destructive force, then his desire and subsequent attack of female victims reinforces a very violent, heteronormative framework of sexuality. Jack is isolated with Elsa twice in the short film. Once when they are locked in her family crypt, and again when they are caged. Interestingly, these two instances also coincide with both of Jack's forms. He is a man in the crypt and a werewolf in the cage. In neither instance does Jack try to engage with Elsa romantically, erotically, or forcefully. Whatever is supposed to be true about werewolf sexuality, Jack's connection to Elsa can hardly be gleaned along the lines of heterosexual desire. Like bisexual subjects, then, Jack's relationships are not determined by attraction to one gender, nor do his desires adhere to the prescribed norms of heterosexuality. The brevity of Jack's relationships to both Ted and Elsa may make it difficult to clearly define his sexuality, but like bisexual subjects, his desires and connections certainly seem to clear the superhero status quo. The last aspect of Werewolf by Night that I want to address, in terms of its capacity to be read as a text evocative of bisexuality, is its avoidance of cure tropes. According to Ransom, throughout werewolf literature and media, one dominant motif is that werewolves can be cured, and that those cursed as or transformed into werewolves would necessarily want to be rid of their transformative natures. The incorporation of cure plot reinforces the idea that what we fear and find intolerable are these crises of signification. An examination of biphobic discourse seems to reveal similar anxieties. As Kless notes, bisexuality is often seen as simply being a phase that will ultimately be left behind, as a person finally comes close to embrace his or true either homo or heterosexual identity. In this view, bisexual identification is cast as a problematic temporary position or transitory stage that stems from a person's indecisiveness, lack of self-knowledge, denial, or cowardice. In our heteronormative culture, many bisexual people internalize this kind of bi-negativity and may even believe that it is impossible for their desires and connections to extend beyond prescribed binaries. For people who face fear, rejection, or even violence from those around them in response to claiming bisexuality, there may be the temptation to talk oneself and others into believing that they don't have to be bisexual, that they can change. Jack articulates similar sentiments when he and Elsa are caged together and she expresses growing fear. In an attempt to calm her and maintain their rapport, he assures her that he has learned how to control his transformation, and that the werewolf is not indicative of his true self. Refreshingly, however, Giacchino never moves the plot of the story any further in the direction of curing Jack. In fact, after he and Ted have escaped, and Elsa sits amidst the ruin of her patriarchal heritage, Judy Garland's voice wafts into the frame, and as the film blooms from black and white into full color, she begins to sing "Somewhere Over the Rainbow." Not, see? Not only does the manifestation of the full spectrum of colors and the reference to queer iconography sung by a queer icon emphasize the queerness of the show's conclusion, but like Dorothy, Jack, Ted, and Elsa all finish their stories sitting contentedly with the multidimensionality of their lives. Delightful. Thank you.
Sure, that would be rad.
I don't want to interrupt because it's noisy.
Thank you. I believe that was Maria Sanfilippo. Also, we can exchange information and I'll send you the whole bibliography.
Awesome. Are we good? Okay. All right. As you may guess, this is a paper about werewolves. More importantly, it's about what it means to be a werewolf from the werewolf's point of view. We know what legends, stories, movies, and popular culture have to say about werewolves and their various associations with, among other things, the animalistic side of human nature, our appetites and lust for violence or sexuality, the natural or mystical cycles of change and transformation, and even the mythic patterns of birth, destruction, and rebirth. But these are stories about werewolves, not stories of werewolves, if such things exist, meaning both werewolves and their stories. For the purposes of this conversation, we're going to assume that they do. As evidence, I'm going to look at a couple of stories told by werewolves, albeit in their human voices. Like the werewolves themselves, these stories are hybrid, shape-shifting, and I will argue, queer in nature. In fact, I might suggest that those are all one and the same. Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, who I'm sure all of you have heard of, argues that all monsters might be seen as, quote, disturbing hybrids whose externally incoherent bodies resist attempts to include them in any systematic structuration. And so the monster is dangerous, a form suspended between forms that threatens to smash distinctions, end quote. As shapeshifters, werewolves embody such resistance to distinction and coherence of form. But what's queer about werewolves? Well, what is queerness but a kind of incoherence, a felt alienation from others and from ourselves, from our bodies, from our minds, from our desires and their manifestations, from our sense of self and identity, and from the place of that self in its social context. We often insist on queerness being delineated along the spectrums of gender or sexuality, the uncertainty or fluidity of those things, which can certainly be queer, but are not the sum of queerness as an experiential category or as a state of being. For those born with more than one racial or ethnic heritage and forced to identify themselves on forums, in conversations, in political discourse, race can certainly be queer. For a young person experiencing the physical, mental, and emotional transformations of puberty and adolescence, becoming an adult is undoubtedly a queer journey. For those raised in a culture that has been marginalized, oppressed, demonized, sent to the res or the ghetto or the detention camp, or literally murdered in the streets for simply existing, culture can be a queer inheritance. Philip Bernard House, in fact, argues for, quote, the inherent queerness in every sense of the lycanthropic figure, noting that, quote, the werewolf might be seen as a natural signifier for queerness in its myriad forms, including homoeroticism, but equally important in the case of werewolves is the idea of queer as anything which actively disrupts normativity, transgresses the boundaries of propriety, and interferes with the status quo in closed social and sexual systems, end quote. Disruption, transgression, the crossing of boundaries, the shifting of the normal into the queer, this is what the werewolf is, not just represents. In a short essay on his own 2016 werewolf novel, Mongrels, Stephen Graham Jones reflects on his own early experience of alienation and his longing for transformation. He writes, quote, when you're 12, you want to be anybody else, anything. Werewolf, that was just my first option, and it was mostly for a night. What I wanted to be in the day was a kid with blonde hair, blue eyes, and a gold rope chain necklace. The necklace is very important for this new identity to work. Neither happened. I didn't become a werewolf. I stayed an Indian in West Texas where there aren't any Indians. The longing, the need to become something other than what we are, isn't unique to adolescence, but the urgency of that moment is only compounded by the recognition that what we are in the world is deficient in some way, at least in the eyes of those around us, and perhaps even in our own. To be a child, to be poor, to be brown-skinned, to be an Indian, even to be human, may feel like an injustice, like a punishment, certainly a disappointment when we compare it to what we imagine ourselves to be, anybody, anything else. Part of this longing is also to be somewhere else, anywhere else, rather than in a place where we don't exist, an Indian where there aren't any Indians. What's interesting about what young Stephen Jones wants to be, though, isn't just that it's anything else, but that it's two different things, a werewolf and a kid with blonde hair, blue eyes, and a gold necklace. Both equally strange to him, equally dangerous, perhaps equally monstrous, but also equally real, at least in the world of mongrels. Both can exist, and more importantly, find others like themselves. Indians, on the other hand, are never even named in the novel, and the narrator never identifies himself as such. Instead, he is only what young Stephen imagined himself to be, a werewolf. Not a white kid, because that would be too far-fetched. He can only have part of Stephen's fantasy, and the part that's closest to his reality, because remarkably, the life of a werewolf and the life of an Indian in West Texas aren't really all that different, at least in the heart of a young boy. The narrator of the novel is at one point told by another character that, quote, being a werewolf isn't just teeth and claws, it's inside. It's how you look at the world. It's how the world looks back at you. And how does the world look at you if you're a young, poor, indigenous person in America? Likely it's through a myriad of lenses that reflect and refract our collective history, perceptions, biases, guilt, hybrid identities, and importantly, in this and other novels by Jones, our popular culture. Movies, television shows, commercials, music, fiction, even roadside kitsch provide images of both indigenous people and their culture and of the wolf in all their various popular guises, which are often contradictory, as loners or packs, predators or hunters, noble or savage, victims or criminals, natural or monstrous. The blending of these images for the narrator is a sign of both his longing for identity and belonging and his immersion in this culture and its assumptions. But in embracing the werewolf identity, he's also attempting to challenge those assumptions, even shape them, at least within the scope of the imagined audience of his narrative. A story, like the stories of his grandfather, that, quote, keeps changing, transforming, becoming. And like himself, the story is a mongrel, a hybrid of fact and fiction, myth and reality. It is the messy manifestation of his and his community's greatest fears and also their deepest longings. As he tells us, quote, everything's a trade-off when you're a werewolf. It's like the world wants us to be monsters, like it won't let us live the way normal citizens do. Among his examples of how the world wants us to be monsters, the narrator shares stories that might be familiar to many people of color in the United States, of being followed, watched, harassed, treated as a criminal, often killed for transgressions both real and imagined. He writes, quote, the same way animals and cops know werewolves, so do security guards and salespeople and clerks. If you ask them why, they might not say werewolves, would probably just shrug, say there's something shady about us, isn't there? This instinctive animal-like wariness and suspicion on the part of, quote, normal citizens is met by the wolf's own natural response. Werewolves can feel that kind of constant attention. It's a special radar we're born with that gets more and more sensitive every year. This racialized monstrosity isn't the only kind that werewolves experience. There's also the grim reality that sexuality, reproduction, and even love don't work the same way for werewolves as for humans. Early on, the narrator learns or is led to believe that werewolves can only successfully reproduce with humans, but that to do so means death to that human from the violent birth of the werewolf pup. Quote, with a werewolf loving and killing, they're the same act. This leads him to conclude that, quote, I guess that makes love the actual infection in our blood. Later in the story, the narrator meets a sheep, which is a werewolf who's forgotten how to transform, who tells him, quote, that's what we are, kid, animals that never should have existed, accidents, reminders about who should mount who and who shouldn't. Werewolf sexuality, then, is also a queer monstrosity. But what is the trade-off for living this life of marginalization, discrimination, and dangerous sexuality? Why does the narrator long to experience his first shift and become part of this seemingly tragic and painful existence? For him, as for young Stephen Jones, the answer to that lies in his own secret longings for transformation, for becoming, and for belonging. As he tells us, quote, "I had a box of important stuff too, of secrets and dreams, of unicorn shit." The unicorn shit is because his Uncle Darren, he's being tracked by a wildlife biologist who tracks his scat. So he starts eating bags of glitter and tinsel so that he can leave colorful scat as a gift for his secret admirer. In explaining the relationship between werewolves and humans, the narrator's Uncle Darren tells him, quote, "If you're not a beautiful monster, then you're a villager. To be a villager is not simply to be normal, to be human, or even to be safe. It is to be dangerous in a different way. Villagers are the ones who come for you with torches and pitchforks. Villagers watch you, follow you. They look for signs of strangeness or difference. And when they feel threatened, they drive you from your home and send you back out on the road to wander, searching for the next meal, the next job, the next rundown trailer, or backwoods rent house." When Darren distinguishes between beautiful monsters and villagers, it's not clear if the difference lies in their monstrosity or in their beauty. Because for the young narrator, as for Stephen Jones, there is certainly beauty in being a werewolf, a beauty that he longs for and hopes to claim as his birthright. What is queerness then but a desire for transformation into a different, truer, more powerful, and more beautiful self, even if that self is seen as monstrous by others, or maybe especially when it is seen as monstrous by a world that resists and fears such transformation? The narrator acknowledges that his own account of such transformations may be nothing but a fiction. It was a story, of course. It's all we've got. I forgot to change my slide a long time ago. Sorry. The narrator acknowledges that his own account of such transformation may be nothing but a fiction. It was a story, of course. It's all we've got, he tells us. Like his grandfather's stories, it is one made up of truth and lies, secrets and confessions. Quote, "Never any proof, just a story that keeps changing, like it's twisting back on itself, biting its own stomach to chew the poison out." Such stories, he has learned, can be painful as well as beautiful. But as the author Stephen Graham Jones tells us in his essay, if you wrap yourself in the right story, everything makes sense. And in the end, the story that makes sense is the only one that matters. I have one more story that I'll talk about more briefly. Yeah. While Jones's werewolf coming-of-age story celebrates the beautiful monster that his protagonist dreams of becoming, Micheline Hess's webcomic Diary of a Mad Black Werewolf acknowledges the violence and horror of being a werewolf, but also sees the need that this monstrous identity fills for her main character, a black woman living in New York City and experiencing the real-life horrors that have become all too familiar: police violence, racist Karens, predatory men, and more. Ara, her protagonist, is a member of an ancient clan of werewolves, the Queen Protea clan, who are of African origin, but now represent the entire African diaspora. Their sigil is the Queen Protea flower, Protea magnifica, a plant indigenous to the Cape region of South Africa and named for the Greek god Proteus, son of Poseidon, a watery shapeshifter known for his prophetic powers and adaptability to change. The name may come from the diverse variety of colors and shapes in the Protea family, as well as their adaptability to their environment. What's more, the Protea magnifica is monoecious, meaning that its flowers contain both male and female sexual organs, allowing flowers on the same plant to potentially pollinate each other. Its seeds are highly durable, allowing them to survive frequent wildfires along the Cape and to be dispersed by the wind. All of these qualities, shape-shifting, adaptation, persistence, survival, are also true of the werewolves who wear the flower as their symbol. Ara's current pack are all young or young-appearing black women in New York: Ara, Charmel, and Ayana. Their relationship is unclear. Are they family, friends, lovers, all of the above? But they hunt and party together and share a common taste for mostly white oppressors. They are cast as avengers of racial and social injustices committed primarily against black and brown people, as well as against women. In the course of any given girls' night out, they devour brutal cops, Klansmen, predatory men, the hateful Karens, and ICE agents who prey on the helpless and the vulnerable. This apparently has been their role for centuries. In this modern world, the threats go beyond overt racism and violence, though. Ara reflects on the changes that have been wrought on her neighborhood of Harlem during her long life. Barely half a century has passed and so much has changed. Sorry, that's a quote. The streets, once crackling with the fierceness of black vitality, have been power washed and scoured, and now, well, the pale ones clutch their bags to their breast as I walk past. But I am not the misfit here, not at all. Ara's confidence in her own sense of self and in her purpose is a stark contrast to Jones's adolescent werewolf, but her recognition of the injustice and marginalization of her people, both her human and werewolf clans, reflects a similar merging of those two identities, an awareness of her own hybridity, her in-betweenness, and her role in mediating the space between these identities. Quote, "For centuries it has been this way. Oppress, torture, kill. Hunt, kill, eat. An endless merry-go-round that never stops and never seems to slow down. We must do this to survive, to maintain some kind of balance, whether it makes us dizzy or not." Hess herself has called Ara and her clan, quote, "the embodiment of black rage," bringing a kind of vigilante justice to those who have avoided it. But I would argue that they also embody various queer identities as well, as black women in America, as shapeshifters, predator avengers, ageless warriors, and potentially hermaphroditic beings, and as creatures capable of shifting not just between bodies, but between species, cultures, and histories. That is to say, they are the embodiment of a queer monstrosity and the inhabitants of what Gloria Anzaldúa calls a borderland. Quote, "A borderland is a vague and undetermined place created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. It is in a constant state of transition. The prohibited and the perverse, the queer, the troublesome, the mongrel, the mulatto, the half-breed, the half-dead. In short, those who cross over, pass over, or go through the confines of the normal," end quote. As with Jones's indigenous werewolves and Hess's diasporic black werewolves, Anzaldúa sees this borderland and its inhabitants, as well as their stories, not as just as hybrids stuck forever in the margins and the shadows, but as hybrids in the process of becoming something new and powerful, something beautiful, and something explicitly queer. Queerness, she suggests, is an evolution of human nature, quote, "the embodiment of the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage, and the coming together of opposite qualities within." Interestingly, that image of a marriage of opposites is similar to the one invoked by Jones's young werewolf in Mongrels when confronted with the competing stories of his uncle and aunt about the origins of werewolves. He writes, quote, "Since I couldn't pick between either of their stories, I made up my own, the unholy union, those two star-crossed lovers the world always needs, that werewolves needed them too, that kept us part of the world." His origin story, though marred by tragedy, is also infused with desire and longing. He later learns that these unions of opposites need not always be tragic or star-crossed, that love and family are possible even for werewolves, and that however unholy or queer the union, there is a place for them in the story that he himself is writing. Thank you.
So mine's not about werewolves. So they made me sit at my own little table over here. Just as a content warning, there is a cartoon depiction of male nudity and gay sex in the presentation, so avert your eyes if you feel the need. In the popular Western imagination, the figure of the vampire has been associated with transgressive sexuality since Stoker and Le Fanu. However, long before these authors' innovations, pre-modern vampire scares were generally associated with outbreaks of diseases like tuberculosis, not coincidentally known as consumption. Before germ theory, these outbreaks were seen as providential, with a spiritual or moral cause that manifested in the diseased body. Discussions of AIDS likewise saw the epidemic as a moral crisis, since intravenous drug use and gay sex were two of the main vectors of transmission. In what follows, I'll explore connections between disease, and in particular HIV and AIDS, and vampires in the popular imagination from the early years of the AIDS epidemic up to the contemporary streaming adaptation of Anne Rice's classic novel, Interview with the Vampire. In the course of this history, we'll see the vampire transformed from an instrument of virulent homophobia and repression to an ecstatic representation of queer desire. In 1987, the supermarket tabloid Weekly World News ran a story with the headline, "Vampire attacks have reached an all-time low as AIDS terror sweeps Eastern Europe." Vampires, it seems, were particularly high risk for contracting AIDS because the majority of the undead are, quote, flaming homosexuals. Weekly World News mixed crass homophobia and AIDS-baiting sensationalism to titillate their readers, tropes that were hardly surprising at the height of the epidemic and which were picked up by more mainstream papers like the Chicago Tribune. While Weekly World News was hardly a credible source for news on the AIDS epidemic or the undead, one perversely innovative trope the tabloid advanced was the idea that AIDS was, in fact, a threat to vampire kind, poisoning their food supply and leading to autocannibalism and demands that people living with AIDS be clearly labeled with tattoos. And this imagined Romanian lady vampire shows up multiple times. There's a lot of reuse and recycling and remixing of the art in these quote unquote art in these stories. Who the paper asks its readers is the greater monster, the legendary undead or the AIDS-infected sodomite. With a wink and a nudge, the paper makes its answer plain. Some of these ideas are ripped from actual headlines in which dentists refuse service to people living with AIDS and in which politicians floated ideas like tattoos and even concentration camps on the Great Plains where people with AIDS could be kept away from the straight and well population. Versions of the idea connecting vampirism to communicable and especially sexually transmitted diseases remain remarkably persistent. On contemporary Reddit boards, players of Vampire the Gathering fret over whether their vampire avatars can become infected with HIV and other STIs. And the QAnon cult and other reactionaries spread the conspiracy theory that the COVID-19 vaccine would turn red-blooded Americans into mindless fiends hungry for red American blood. A profound anxiety about the integrity and impenetrability of cisgender heterosexual white male American bodies underlies this discourse, as both gay male sexuality and vampirism implicate the interpenetrability of the masculine body, which is in turn read as a threat to white patriarchal nationalism and, in a grand synecdoche, to the whole of Western society. We see this anxiety play out in vampire apocalypse narratives from 30 Days of Night to Blade to Buffy the Vampire Slayer. When the stakes are high, the stakes come out. When queer artists engage with the figure of the vampire, the threat to the masculine body remains present, though it is mediated in sexier, more playful ways. In Maurice Velikoop's 1998 ABC book, V is for Vampire portrays the seduction of a young nobleman by an effete vampire. Though the 18th century fashions of powdered wig, pink cheeks, and high-heeled shoes somewhat complicate the gender presentation of the mortal man, his body is absolutely masculine. His cock is thicker and longer than the vampire's, and his robust golden physique frames the pale, androgynous vampire draped over him. Though the depiction of the young noble exudes masculine power and sexuality, he is nonetheless helpless, as suggested by the spilled wine on the floor and his lolling head, exposing his throat to the caress of the predator. Despite his arousal, the helplessness of the masculine figure suggests a lack of consent in this tableau. The vampire femme preys upon the more traditionally masculine man, perhaps unintentionally underscoring the toxic stereotype of queer sexual predation. Though more amenable to camp than many of his contemporaries, Velikoop is not immune to the hypermasculine tropes favored by queer erotic artists of the late 20th century. The femme and the androgynous, as embodied in Velikoop's Vampire, become the monstrous site where queer artists relocate the homophobic suspicions of predatory sexuality leveled against the wider queer community by the dominant culture. 2 decades earlier, one artist expressed sympathy for queer monsters in a way that would influence generations of postmodern Gothic media, including, I think, Velikoop's V is for Vampire. Anne Rice's novel, Interview with the Vampire, was published in 1976, a few years before the first recognized cases of HIV/AIDS in the US. Interview is the first book in Rice's Vampire Chronicles series, which came to encompass 13 novels. Of some of them of better quality than others. The story begins in the 1790s in New Orleans and features a queer-coded vampire family made up of Lestat de Liancourt, the French debauché, Louis de Pointe du Lac, the French colonial plantation owner, and their misbegotten progeny Claudia, a child vampire turned too young. The novel's framing narrative is both a scene of storytelling and of queer seduction in which the vampire Louis relates his story to young reporter Daniel Malloy, referred to throughout the novel as the boy, whom he has picked up in a San Francisco bar. In response to the enthusiastic encouragement from fans to the story, Rice brought the queer narrative out of subtext in later novels. While Lestat remains omnivorous, Louis is more or less uniformly queer, a solitary intellectual with antecedents in romanticism, more Werther than Byron in his brooding introspection. Rice makes clear that these immortals are immune to diseases that devastate mortal populations, and later novels in the series only glancingly engage with AIDS as a factor in the vampire world. The 1994 film adaptation of Interview was written and produced at the height of the AIDS epidemic in the US. As Ian Clarke astutely observes, the film's portrayal of the vampire couple at the center of the story is not so far removed from the AIDS baiting of tabloid pulp. Clarke writes, quote, like the AIDS-era queer male, these vampires are characterized as abject creatures whose unnatural desires are satiated through the consumption, corruption, and destruction of healthy bodies and heteronormative social boundaries, end quote. The threat to the social order posed by the vampire is neutralized by traumatizing or destroying monstrous queer bodies. A physical rupture that in Clarke's formulation, quote, symbolically cleanses their otherness and eliminates their potential to infect or destroy. Thus, the vampire body becomes the site of voyeuristic thrill for heteronormative audiences fascinated and terrified by queer males and the lethal disease they are presumed to carry, end quote. The impulse to discipline the unruly queer body remains prevalent in vampire media, even in cultural texts that are arguably more inclusive of postmodern queer identities. True Blood, the HBO adaptation of Charlaine Harris's Southern vampire novel series, portrays solitary, monogamous, heterosexual vampires as paragons of morality and restraint, while vampires who join together in larger groups called nests, a term which deliberately invokes vermin, are prone to a madness of licentious sex and bloodlust, and the spread of vampirism among these groups is frequently described in the series as a sexually transmitted disease. Combining vampire appetite with queer or polysexuality is disdained by the white vampire patriarchy embodied in Vampire Bill, the series' vampire protagonist, and the main love interest for Suki, the heroine. Joss Whedon's Buffy the Vampire Slayer portrays its male vampire primary characters as predominantly monogamous heterosexuals who suppress their appetites for blood in order to collaborate with and romance the Slayer herself. Steve Greenwood observes, quote, an aggressive structural disavowal of textual male homosexuality in Buffy, while he still holds out hope for the potential for intervention that comes from Buffy's subtextual queerness. Farrah Mendelssohn asserts that a queer reading of the relationship between Buffy and Willow is likewise disavowed and deferred, enforcing both hetero and homonormative narratives through by erasure, even among characters that are written as queer. While Greenwood in particular sees the remediation of subtext through fanfic as potentially redemptive, ultimately the Buffyverse is as ruled by the heteronormative gaze as was the first film adaptation of Interview. While in the 90s we were placated, if not content with, queer subtext in mainstream media, generational shifts in the media marketplace have resulted in audiences being increasingly dissatisfied with subtext alone. In the 2022 streaming adaptation of Interview with the Vampire, the queer vampire body is the text, and queer appetites, both erotic and sanguine, are centered in a way that was likely impossible in mainstream fiction when Rice first conceived the characters. The showrunners remediate Rice's text in other ways to bring it in line with contemporary values and sensibilities. The setting is moved up to the first decades of the 20th century, and Louis's white slaveholder is transformed to a Creole businessman who operates on the margins of legality to maintain his family's wealth, running brothels in Storyville in which black prostitutes cater to white Johns. The framing narrative of Louis's interview with the journalist Daniel is also revised as an explicitly queer encounter in which Louis picked up Daniel in a gay bar in 1973. Daniel, a recovering addict, claims he was just there to score drugs, but it's clear from this that this excuse rings hollow to both Louis and himself. In the series, Louis has invited Daniel back some 50 years later to finish capturing Louis's story. While the historical setting, again, just skirts direct engagement with the AIDS epidemic, in the updated adaptation, Daniel is experiencing the onset of Parkinson's disease, and the present tense of the framing narrative is the global COVID-19 pandemic. So the specter of disease is never far from the framing narrative. As a queer black man in Jim Crow New Orleans, Louis is a crucible of pent-up rage and frustration, a tension which attracts the decadent Lestat to him in an explicitly queer seduction, and an explicitly queer seduction commences. Lestat is clearly represented as bisexual in the series, and he uses a woman sex worker who has served as Louis's social beard as the means of getting close to him, close to his quarry. In a scene that does not pander to the heterosexual gaze, Louis is seduced and submits. The interpenetration of vampire and sexual appetites is made abundantly explicit, with the actors' porn-ready bodies on display in an erotic aerial ballet. This initial encounter leads to a final consummation in a scene of spectacular violence and sexual collision. Tormented by his submission to and desire of the white vampire, Louis retreats to his childhood church to confess his sins. Lestat disrupts the sacrament and bloodily butchers 2 priests. Wet with the carnage of his kills, Lestat relentlessly pushes Louis to confess his desire and to beg for the more carnal sacrament of his blood, wondering at, quote, the rage you must feel as you choke on your sorrow, which for me resonates with Larry Kramer's mantra, where is your rage? Trying to elicit passion for activism in the queer community. Feet away from the bodies of the priests, Louis again submits, giving up his blood and ingesting Lestat's, and is transformed. With its blasphemous violence and sexual sacrilege, Louis's transformation is a vibrant and violent repudiation of the faith, morals, and strictures of his mortal life. In his embrace of his queer and vampire identities and the appetites that come with both, Louis triumphantly becomes a monster, both the legendary monster that evokes the terror of the undead and the monstrous queer who defies the disciplinary demands of the heterosexual gaze. While the idyll of their early relationship does not last, this remarkable update of Anne Rice's iconic vampire characters exultantly reclaims the queer vampire body. In becoming Monstrous, which, like Deleuze and Guattari's Becoming Animal, is precisely not a metaphor in this context, Louis finds a fullness of expression of his authentic self, which was impossible for the mortal black man bounded by history, geography, and time, and which was likewise impossible for the author to express in the literary marketplace of 1976. To become monstrous is a revolutionary act. In Louis's rage and his defiance, in his appetite and desire, in his embrace of his monstrous self, I feel echoes of a double-barreled post-Stonewall slogan which spat in the eye of straight contempt. You think queers are revolting? You bet your sweet ass we are.
Thank you so much, the 3 of you. So what we're going to do now is the 3 of them will engage in a little conversation for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience for the last 15 minutes. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yep.
Can we get started?
Yep.
Where should we start?
You go.
Oh, I guess I have the list of questions. We brainstormed lots of different connections between our papers the last couple of days, just in thinking about what are the things that tie all these things together besides the obvious, right? These are all about queer monstrosity in some way. Now, how we're using that term queer, I think, is a little different, and we have different sort of variations on that. So we could maybe start with that and how it is relevant to our text and how it's relevant to the conversation as a whole, if we want.
Yeah. So for me, it was sort of working with like pretty classic definitions of queer, so like Eve Sedgwick, and this idea of essentially kind of any non-heteronormative sexuality or gender identity, but if you want to extrapolate away from that, gaps, dissonances, excess, right? Anything that disrupts a hegemonic norm could be counted as queer. And obviously, because a lot of what I was dealing with is a sort of connotative reading, I can only come down so hard on the side of like, this is definitely about a sexual identity. Although, of course, I'm suggesting that it's hinted at. But I think a lot of the scholarship that I was engaging with is definitely sort of leaning more heavily into queer as being very much a reference to types of embodiment and being in the world, right? In addition to, Harry Binshoff talks about how queer can be a performance, a moment, a piece of art, right? It doesn't necessarily have to manifest in a person. So there is certainly that too for me, reading a very sort of mainstream popular text. I'm also interested in those moments that bubble up and show the cracks in what otherwise looks like a very homogeneous surface.
Yeah, I mean, I think I said up front that I wasn't specifically talking about queer in the sense of gender or sexuality, although that also finds its way in there. But I was borrowing partly from some monstrous studies definitions of what monstrosity is, right? This, as you were saying, the instability of forms or of structures or of categorization. And then obviously, as I said at the end, the Gloria Anzaldua's sort of conception of queerness as being related to race and place and community. And I felt like in both these texts, that was really what was at the core of the story, is both these characters sort of dealing with the complexity of those identities, their racial identities, where they come from, where they live, their cultural sort of connections to each other. And then obviously sexuality comes into each of these stories. I just didn't feel it was necessarily central to the story. And so that's not the definition that I was focusing on, but I think it's similar in that it's combining both understandings of monstrosity, understandings of queerness, and then kind of looking closely at these texts.
And I think in looking specifically at gay male identity in this context, I'm interested in the idea that like the gay male and the vampire in some ways that counters the definitions of monstrous that you've used about being incoherent and fluid. The gay male and the vampire are almost too coherent, too fixed in their focus on, which makes them monstrous in a different way. And the vampire doesn't age; they don't change, and they're kind of essentialized to the raw function of their body in being pure appetite for survival, and which has a lot of parallels in the way, especially during the early years of the AIDS epidemic, gay men were portrayed in media as being purely about sexual appetite, and so I think there's some real resonances there that can be explored more deeply.
I love too that your paper also brings out, I was going to say teases out, but I think it's like more provocative than that, the activist element of queer as well. So like your reference, to Stonewall at the end, and to the fact that this is tied, these stories, right, are so tied up with politics and necropolitics that you are also bringing us to a very, I think, refreshing and helpful reminder that queer is not just a nice theory, right? In fact, it really shouldn't be.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I'm old enough now to have actually been in Queer Nation and marched with ACT UP in the 80s and 90s, and I feel like that level of activism has transformed over the years. I think it's like I really admire though the insistence on representation that we see from Gen Z activists, And the diversity of representation, you know, when I was in ACT UP, like there were no black men in the Boston chapter. Like it was all white guys, all bougie white guys. And that was like the face of gay activism for a long time. And I think we see a lot more gender diversity and racial and ethnic diversity that's very visible in queer activism now. And I think that is significant progress from what my generation had.
So another theme that we kind of recognized is the sort of representation or manifestation of queer family in all of our texts. And this is something we wanted to talk about. And it just dawns on me that we've been collaborating for quite a long time. And this is why we pitched this panel where we call ourselves partners in crime. And we're actually kind of constantly joking / we would totally take it if somebody wants to give it to us for real about getting a polyspousal hire somewhere. Just because we've formed our own sort of queer kinship here. And for me, like when our papers kind of came together and we were thinking through, you know, how this became a panel, again, Harry Benshoff's work was really helpful to me. I kind of had a chuckle about his idea of this queer domestic couple. Because, of course, in the classical Hollywood monster movies, werewolves and vampires end up getting coupled all the time, right? But beyond those sort of queer familial ties, I do think that one of the things that I really like about Werewolf by Night, if you cannot make the argument that there is any kind of explicit sexuality or any, like, explicit sort of romantic relationships going on, I think you can definitely see these very strong sort of waves of kinship, and that's what, I almost hate to use this word, that provides the humanity that makes it so compelling and relatable and lovable. And in fact, it's something that Jack encourages when he's trying to get Elsa to understand that it's worthwhile to buck these horrible traditions in terms of hunting monsters. You know, he's like, just use his name. All you have to do is be humane. And I think that it is effective in this very short film, primarily because that's what the director, the cast, the writers, the creators have leaned into. What makes us love monsters, in fact, in some part, is their humanity, right? And how they get us to feel humane. And it comes through these queer bonds, which I love.
You know, when you were talking about how the Universal monsters were often paired up, it immediately made me think of the Abbott and Costello movies, right? Because they're also like a pair who get paired with the monsters, and they also have that kind of, you know, playful, homosocial, obviously a more comic version of that. But yeah, that kind of, you know, bringing together of opposites, right, of these types of characters. In terms of like queer family, obviously in both these stories that I'm looking at, family is essential. There's a great line somewhere in Mongrels where the narrator sort of comes to this realization. He says, even though he's been longing to be a werewolf all this time, he says, we're not a pack, we're a family, right? And he's you know, he's as desperate for that as he is to sort of become himself, to become the werewolf. He's also constantly longing for family. He's being raised by his aunt and uncle because his mother, who was his aunt's twin sister, died in childbirth, like most werewolf mothers, at least as they understand it. And so he keeps literally seeing his mother in his aunt's face because it's her twin, and his Uncle Darren is essentially his father. They raise him. And that's something that he wants to be part of the family because they're both werewolves, and he thinks, I can't really be part of this family until I become a werewolf. And so it really is not just a longing for his personal identity, like to be what he's supposed to be, but also to be really a part of the family that he wants to be a part of. And I think the Diary of a Mad Black Werewolf kind of takes that too. In the beginning, you're not clear that she's not alone. Like we have this image of monsters as always being alone, right? And in the first part of the story, she's by herself, and then suddenly like she's staring out the window, sort of like sad and longing, and then one of her girlfriends comes in and says, "Are you ready? Like, aren't we going out? It's time. I'm getting hungry." And then you realize she actually has a pack, right? They're right there and they're ready to go together. So again, it brings in this whole, side of the monster that we're not necessarily always thinking about, is that need for each other.
And in the streaming adaptation of Interview, the fraught relationship between Louis and his living human family is really foregrounded. And like, they don't want to know about where the money comes from. They just like the big house, you know. So they're very in denial about his positionality in the community and stuff. And the things that they reject him for, his criminality and his anger and his sort of ferocity, are the things that Lestat recognizes and is drawn to. And that moment of like recognition where he says, your rage, and where he recognizes Louis's rage and sorrow, is what really tips Louis over into submitting finally to transforming into a vampire and brings him into that family. And like, it seems perverse a little bit, I think, that rage and sorrow are the things that is attractive in him to the predator, but he's also, it's the things that have helped keep him together as he's, as a, black queer man in Jim Crow New Orleans. It's, that grief and rage would have been his constant companions, and for that to be validated and recognized by his new family is deeply compelling to Louis in the series. Rice's racial politics were not that nuanced, especially in the first couple of novels. I think she, getting to watch her like learn and grow over the years, she got somewhat better. But and Rice did a lot of her learning very publicly, and so we see a lot of interesting like public reversals and things, which I think is admirable that she chose to do that, and not like, let's say, like Joyce Carol Oates, who just retrenches into her ick sometimes.
Well, I mean, it's interesting to think about too that a lot of Anne Rice's learning, the impetus for it was her family.
Her son,
Right.
yeah.
Right?
Her son Christopher is a gay novelist, and he has a kind of crazy podcast, but and he's also an executive producer on the series, and a lot of the remediation that the showrunners did were validated by Anne Rice before her death, and continue to be supported by Christopher afterwards. So.
Depending on where we are in time, I had one more, but we can also open it up before
It's
time.
10:42.
Okay, cool.
So
One more?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think the other sort of common thing that we all sort of talked about in different aspects was curses versus cures, versus maybe something like heritage, which is the word that Jack uses at some point, right, about his facial decorations. But this idea that being a monster is a curse for which you must seek a cure, right? And obviously it deals with the disease trope, and it deals with, but in both of my narratives, I think it was important that neither of these werewolves consider what they are to be a curse. In fact, they're both sort of longing for it, especially the teenage werewolf who desperately wants this thing, even though he comes to recognize all the things, the drawbacks that come with it. There are certain things that are a curse, right? At least as he understands it, sexuality is cursed for him, and yet he still wants this. So this kind of tension between this idea of the curse versus the cure, I think, was kind of interesting in all these narratives. Did you want to say
Yeah,
something?
I mean, I will say that this is one aspect, I think, like, you're going to have to take this with a grain of salt, because it's still a Disney Marvel property. I do think that it's possible to see that Giacchino and the rest of the creators were being a little bit subversive in terms of casting Jack Russell. He's played by Gael Garcia Bernal, right? And he therefore becomes the sort of Mexican version of this character. So traditionally in classical Hollywood films, the monster was often made knowable because he was a foreign other. So a lot of the actors who played the classical monsters, of course, were foreigners according to American sensibilities. So I think there's this danger that, of course, you could see that with this iteration of Jack Russell, but I think they subvert that by making him proud of who he is and about his lineage, right? He doesn't see being a werewolf as a curse. He sees it as an inheritance from his ancestors, and he talks about how they surround him like an atmosphere. He's wearing de los Muertos paint to honor his ancestors. So I think that's a really interesting subversion of the typical sort of racial politics of classic monster movies, and then also this idea that it's a curse. He, in fact, is quite proud of it. Yes, again, he has that wobble when he's in the cage and he's trying to get Elsa not to be like deathly afraid of him. I kind of think that's reasonable. I'm leaning into this idea that he comes out the other side, like, he's not sitting there in his blanket, like, lamenting who he is. He's just like, is everything okay? Great, like, I saved the day again. And Man Thing's like, what the hell? No, you know.
What did I do at the party last night?
Right. So I do think that I loved, again, like I said, I love that there's, on one hand, a total kind of eschewing of curing Jack, and on the other hand, I think there's a very subtle subversion of the curse, specifically as it's typically been racialized.
Right, and I think with both my texts, that's explicitly, you know, being a werewolf is part of their heritage. It's part of their racial, cultural, you know, communal heritage. And so it's not in any way seen as something that they want to get rid of or cure themselves of. And so I think that ties it directly to this idea of werewolfism as a part of your core identity, right?
And in Rice's cosmology, vampirism can't be cured. But as we've been talking, I'm thinking that I'm going to have to go back and deal with Catherine Bigelow's Near Dark, which 1986, I think, and it ends with a blood transfusion, in which, if you know 1986, but getting a blood transfusion was a pretty fraught experience, but it does have a curative sort of narrative in there around vampirism, and young Adrian Pasdar is worth watching the movie for if you haven't already seen it. So, so I think the curse and cure narrative, like Louis maunders on and on in the novels about, you know, is this a curse? Is it a gift? The dark gift? Which is much less interesting, I think, than some of those more than what Bigelow does with it in Near Dark and in some other films. So.
I mean, I do have to say, like, the 90s interview film, that is one great line where Tom Cruise is like, oh, Louis, stop whining. You're like, yeah, man.
Yes, please.
Great. So let's move on to Q&A from the audience. So this is for the streaming viewers. So let's go start with Vesper.
Thank you. Thank you guys for your talk. I love analysis of aesthetics and pop culture. It fills me with great pleasure. But I think that's also kind of part of my problem, too, is that I'm 22. And when you brought up Gen Z, I was like, oh, no. Because, like, as someone who is at the intersection and loves looking at, like, the people who came before me and are doing the work at the intersection of art, scholarship, and activism, I've already kind of become disillusioned because I have this feeling that, like, especially people in my generation love, like you said, the where is your rage thing. I've noticed people my age, and people have always done this, but they love, like, especially queer people too, love to just bask in the pleasure of aesthetics and kind of are just I found that people have already started to do this thing where they're just kind of building up the life around them as everything kind of crumbles, and are just kind of like, I'm going to make my life beautiful and I'm going to engage in these dark aesthetics and kind of use them as, in a way, like a shield, like a pleasurable shield, and aren't actually engaging in the rage and really doing anything with it. And I found, like, as an academic too, I've become really worried about the academic version of that, which is to, like, bask in the pleasure of ideas. And so my question was, like, how, as somebody who wants to do art in my life but also wants to center activism, how do you think monsters and the queer appetite for romantic aesthetic could possibly be marshaled to transform rage into action?
That's a great question.
Ooh, what a gorgeous question. So I think one of the things that I've become increasingly interested in is publicly engaged scholarship and service learning. And I think if we can find ways to bring our work into the communities that we're interested in and that we want to be in dialogue with, that is important. So like go to a public library and organize a monster mask making workshop and for kids who don't have other outlets, creative outlets, things like that. I think that the striking a balance between the sort of traditional modes of scholarly communication and engaging wider publics is going to be increasingly important to continue to make the academy relevant in society, especially as this strain of anti-intellectualism creeps from the fringes of the right into the mainstream. And it's not even creeping anymore, it's like rushing. We are literally fighting for our survival as a profession, and we're going to have to change in order to do that. And I think it's but I also don't believe that it's too late for like my generation in the academy. Like just because you have like tenure doesn't mean you can. That actually means that you can do more shit, right? Because you're safe. Unfortunately, what we see is that it's junior scholars and students who are the ones who are doing the activism, and there's a terrible, terrible complacency that seems to set in once people get the ink dry on that tenure document. So, despite whatever attestations of activism they might have had when they were junior. So like use that safety for good, use it to change the way we do peer review, use it to change the way publicly engaged scholarship is evaluated for tenure and promotion. Use it to encourage collaboration rather than the sort of false monastic narrative of the lone scholar toiling away in their garret. It's nonsense. It's always been nonsense. And use your position to elevate voices of BIPOC and queer people, and of independent scholars, librarians, and others who we wouldn't be able to do this stuff without. So I think that it's a lot of the sort of systemic problems that Mallory was alluding to yesterday in the film industry are replicated and kind of concentrated in the academy as well. So, find your allies, find your community, and do work that you're passionate about is the thing that I would say is something that we each as individually have to choose to do.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that's pretty close to my heart too, as both a librarian and a librarian in Texas, of all places, where even if you want to, step away from, activism and just build your own little library world, it's impossible. It's come to us. So now we either have to step up and defend ourselves and defend our communities and our students and whoever else, or we just, back down and disappear. I mean, those are our only two choices. So I feel like this is a discussion that's happening also in our profession where we're trying to decide, like, at what point do we, stop, listening to those authoritarian voices that are telling us you can't do this and you can't do that, you can't have DEI and you can't have trans awareness and you can't have, I mean, we're getting this every day, constantly, and some of it is legislative. So it's not like it's just people talking, it's action happening. And so we are actively asking these questions, like, at some point, where do our own ethics and our own commitments come in, and where do we have to stand firm and say, I don't care what the legislation says, I don't care what the policy says, we are going to, have a queer comics outreach, we're going to do, a DEI initiative. I mean, we're a Hispanic serving institution where I work, so it's like, that's right there in our title, Hispanic serving. So if we're gonna stop doing that, we stop being what we are. So I agree, and it's frustrating because there's so much pressure to either just shut up and go away or go along, and it's very, very difficult to find people who are in a position, as Spencer was saying, to do that resistance, right? Because as you said, it ends up being students, it ends up being contingent faculty, it ends up being early career people, and they're the ones least in the least position of strength to do this. So yeah, I get both the disillusionment and the frustration, but also this kind of the rage. The rage is there.
I would also just say, unfortunately, I'm no longer in a classroom, but I was in a teaching-focused position for the whole first part of my career, and it's what I loved most. And I think that's another great place for an artist to be, and I think it's not too strong to say that you can make real change by enabling your students to create and read radically. You can use your classroom to pass on that sort of like aesthetic love, but then equally to give them tools to recognize the disruptive power of the kinds of things that they can create or the kinds of readings they can conduct. They don't have to read with the grain. And I think that there's something, again, when we're talking about academic institutions, as much as especially larger universities rely on tuition and enrollment to operate, teaching is often not valued as much as research or other aspects, of the profession. And so that actually makes it kind of punk rock.
Yeah.
So I just think that if that's a part of your future, whether it's in a university setting or you as a creator take the opportunity to teach others independently, I think you also have a lot of power there to use the monstrous to either make more monster artists or help them to find monsters and figure out how monsters continue to make meaning.
Make more monsters, that's the
Yeah.
yeah, I'm not an artist, although Micheline Hess, who did Diary of a Mad Werewolf, she, in a couple of interviews, talks about how, most of her earlier work has been children's books, and she says she really loves this kind of cute, pleasant, playful style. But she started doing Diary of a Mad Black Werewolf as part of one of those like monthly challenges where you're, it's like a cartoon a day or something like that. So she started that as a webcomic, and it just kind of evolved, I don't know, intuitively, or, it became this expression of what she calls black rage. And it wasn't what she was aiming to do. It wasn't what she set out to do. It just sort of came up as she was writing this piece. And it turned into something for her. And I think it became that kind of expression that spontaneous is not the right word, because I'm sure there's like a whole lifetime of experience behind that. But it changed the way she sort of thought about her own work and what she could do with it and who her audience was and how she can address them and things like that. So I think that's part of it too. And a lot of her work started out as webcomics, and so that was kind of her medium for, creating and putting the work out there, and has only recently started thinking about print stuff. So I think, finding alternate routes for creating, finding places to do it, and I like the idea of making more monsters.
That should be our new mission statement at the Center for Monster Studies. We make more monsters. Why did I do that? Vampiric teaching, absolutely. Other questions for the panel? Yes.
More of a comment than a question for Spencer, which I just thought your paper is really brilliant. I recently went to see Anne Rice's papers in Tulane. I don't know if you've been there, but and she just has like all of these like really alcoholic kind of rants, like truly. But around the time that she starts writing Interview, you can first of all see that the dynamic she recreates with Louis and Lestat is very much coming out of her marriage. She also has like all these like fantasies of wanting to go to gay bars, like bars with gay men, wearing these like, like very fabulous outfits, but not to be perceived. And the minute her daughter dies, she dreams that her daughter's undead. And then everything is sort of about Interview. But I think what's really interesting about it to me, and I'd be kind of curious to see if you end up seeing these journals, is that it's clearly not only coming out of like what she's experiencing, but that she still sort of uses this homosexual trope. It's not between a man and a woman. She makes a decision to do this sort of like complicated homoerotic dynamic while she sort of remains like invisibilized, in the production of it.
There was a Rolling Stone interview, and I think like 86, 87, where she said that she doesn't feel like a woman, like she feels like she's a gay man, and maybe in today's vernacular she'd be trans or gender nonconforming, although her gender presentation was very like Southern Gothic belle, So I think that complex kind of psychology in the artist is very interesting. But I also feel like it would be irresponsible for me to kind of like try to put too much pressure into that, because like I'd rather work with the texts than try to get into the artist's it's not just death of the author, it's kind of also like respect for the author's like own integrity, and like those sort of things are fascinating. I've looked at Kathy Acker's papers at NYU in the Fales Library, and there's places where she flat out says, I lied about the origin of this book in this interview because I thought the question was dumb, and things like that. So the that kind of mediation through the author, I think, can give us some insights, but it's also something that, just because of my training and my background, I'm not like super comfortable with. But which doesn't mean I'm not going to go look at those papers, right? So, so thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sam, Spencer, and John, for this wonderful panel. And yes, big hand, please, for Sam, Spencer, and John.
We also want to thank you. We know that professional development funds are finite and that conference time is at a premium, and it means a great deal to us that you chose to spend part of your morning with us.
Thank you.